They thought their tanks were invincible. For years, Japan's Type 95 Heigo light tank had rolled across Asia, crushing colonial forces, raiding airfields, and overrunning enemy lines with speed and aggression. Japanese crews believed they were the elite of a modern armored force. Fast, fearless, and unbeatable. But their confidence was built on illusion. And on the night of June 17, 1944, that illusion would burn away in the jungles of Saipan. The story of Japan's most famous tank begins in 1933. At that time, the Imperial Japanese Army's experience in Manchuria had shown that its existing tanks, like the Type 89 medium, were far too slow for modern warfare. They needed something lighter, faster, and easier to transport across Asia's mountains and jungles. Engineer Tomio Hara of Mitsubishi Heavy Industries was tasked with designing the replacement. His solution was revolutionary. A 7-ton machine powered by a 120-horsepower air-cooled diesel engine. It could hit 40 kilometers an hour, carried a 37mm main gun, and was protected by 12 millimeters of armor. That armor could stop rifle bullets, and that was about it. Still, compared to the lumbering tanks of the early 1930s, the Hago was a marvel. It was cheap to build, easy to maintain, and light enough to fit on small island ferries or jungle bridges. In 1935, the Type 95 entered production. 3 crew members, a driver, a gunner, and a commander who also doubled as loader and radio operator, squeezed into its narrow steel hull. Radios were rare. Most communication was done with flags. But despite its primitive design, the tank proved deadly against China's poorly equipped armies. Chinese troops had almost no anti-tank weapons. Against them, the Hago seemed unstoppable, like a steel god of war. From 1937 to 1939, Japan's tanks swept across northern China. The Hago's light armor wasn't a problem when the enemy had no weapons that could penetrate it. Japanese propaganda glorified their armored divisions as symbols of national strength and modernity. But that illusion was shattered in 1939, at the border battle of Khalkhin Gol, when Japan clashed with the Soviet Union. Here, the Hago met Soviet BT-5 and BT-7 tanks, vehicles that were faster, better armed, and much more heavily armored. Soviet 45mm guns punched through Japanese tanks like paper. The Japanese 37mm Sabonitin 30mm rounds, meanwhile, simply bounced off Soviet armor. In a single campaign, the Japanese lost over 100 tanks. Their officers requested upgrades, thicker armor, bigger guns, but Tokyo ignored them. The army still believed light. Mobile tanks were ideal for Asia's terrain. So when the Pacific War began in 1941, the Hago was still Japan's main battle tank. At first, it worked. In Malaya, the British dismissed the idea that tanks could even move through the jungle. They were wrong. Japanese light tanks slipped through narrow trails and rubber plantations, outflanking British positions. The Hago's diesel engine didn't overheat easily, and its narrow tracks gave it excellent mobility on soft ground. When British defenders finally saw Japanese tanks emerging from the trees, panic spread. They had almost no anti-tank guns ready. The same story repeated in the Philippines. In late 1941, American and Filipino troops watched in disbelief as Japanese armor appeared where they thought none could go. In the Battle of WWII, a platoon of Hagos ambushed American M3 Stuart light tanks, the first tank versus tank clash in U.S. Army history. Both sides had 37mm guns, but the Japanese struck first and won the initial encounter. Those victories convinced Japan that their light tanks were still effective. The lessons of Khalkhin Gol were forgotten. By 1944, the Pacific War had turned against Japan. The United States was advancing across the Central Pacific with massive naval firepower and overwhelming air superiority. When U.S. Marines landed on Saipan in June 1944, Japan knew the island had to be held at all costs. It was only 300 miles from Tokyo, within range of American B-29 bombers. Colonel Takashi Goto's 9th Tank Regiment, equipped mostly with Type 95 Hagos and a few larger Type 97 Chihas, was ordered to repel the invasion. Goto's crews were seasoned veterans, many of them trained tank commanders who had fought since China. They had faith in their machines and in the Bushido spirit. The Teido belief that courage could overcome material weakness. But the Americans were unlike any enemy they had faced before. The Japanese. Counterattack began before dawn. 44. Tanks rolled out of hiding, engines rumbling softly through the humid night. Goto's plan was to strike the Marine lines in darkness, punch through, and reach the beach to destroy landing craft and supplies. As they advanced, their tracks clanked over coral and sand. The crews believed they would surprise the Marines, who were still digging in. But the Americans had radar, scouts, and listening posts. They knew the Japanese were coming. Machine gun nests, bazooka teams, and tanks from the 2nd Marine Division waited in ambush. At Oro 300 hours, the Hagos appeared in silhouette, small, fast-moving shadows gliding through the smoke. Then came the sound Marines would never forget, the deep, hammering rhythm of the 50 caliber Browning M2 heavy machine gun. The 50 cal was originally designed to shoot down aircraft. Its armor-piercing ammunition could penetrate more than 20 meters of steel at 200 meters, more than enough to pierce the Hagos' thin armor. When Marines opened fire, the effect was devastating. Tracer rounds streaked across the field, striking the tanks with bright white flashes. The 12mm armor, designed only to stop rifles, offered no resistance. Bullets punched through the sides, through fuel tanks, through men. Some tanks caught fire immediately. Others stopped moving as their crews were killed at their stations. Marine observers were stunned. They could see the 50 cal rounds punching in one side of the tank and exiting the other. By the time American Shermans joined the fight, it was already a massacre. The 75mm guns of the Shermans blew Hagos apart from over 1,000 yards away. When dawn came, 31 Japanese tanks were burning wrecks scattered across the fields. The largest tank attack of the Pacific War had been annihilated in less than an hour. When Marines inspected the battlefield, they were astonished to find tanks riddled with machine gun holes. Some had dozens of clean, round penetrations, neat as if drilled by a carpenter. For the first time, U.S. troops realized that the Japanese tanks they had feared were nothing more than fragile tin boxes. Captured Japanese officers later confessed that their men were devastated. They couldn't believe machine gun fire had destroyed their tanks. Some described the experience as a revelation of death, realizing their armor offered no safety at all. From that point onward, American infantry lost their fear of Japanese armor. Every Jeep-mounted 50 cal, every aircraft gun, every Marine heavy weapon became an anti-tank weapon. After Saipan, Japan's tank arm effectively ceased to exist as an offensive force. Their later tanks, like the Type 3 Chinu and Type 4 Chito, were far superior, with 75mm guns and decent armor, but it was too late. Allied bombing crippled Japan's industry. Only a few prototypes were ever completed, and none saw combat. In the final battles, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, Japanese tanks were buried in defensive positions, used as static bunkers. Their mobility meant nothing, their armor useless. When American flamethrowers and bazookas arrived, they burned those buried tanks alive. The tankers inside fought to the last, but their bravery couldn't stop physics. For Japan's tank crews, the Hago had been more than a weapon. It was a symbol of progress, of pride, of the belief that Japan could match the industrial powers of the West. But Saipan shattered that illusion. Courage, skill, and loyalty had met the raw reality of American firepower, a 50 caliber bullet traveling nearly a kilometer per second. The men who survived the battle understood, something their generals never would, that bravery alone could not overcome steel and science. By war's end, Japan had produced just over 2,300 Type 95 Hagos, fewer than the number of Shermans America produced in a single month of 1944. The balance of power had shifted irrevocably. Today, a handful of Type 95s still exist, rusting relics in Pacific jungles and war museums. When you stand beside one, you can't help but notice how small it really is, barely taller than a man, thin as a car door, and light enough to be pushed by a truck. Inside, the crew compartments are so cramped that a man can barely move. It's hard to imagine anyone thinking they were invincible, but that's what they believed, that faith could substitute for armor, that courage could resist bullets. Saipan proved otherwise. On that night in 1944, Japanese tank crews learned the most brutal truth of modern warfare, that even the strongest spirit cannot stop a 50 caliber round.